Today we're talking about something a little different from your usual camera gear reviews. This isn't a technical spec deep dive, this is a real hands-on experience from a real estate videographer's perspective. Specifically, we're diving into the Viltrox 14mm f4 for Sony E-mount and how it changed the way I shoot interior and exterior walkthroughs. Now, full disclosure, I'm coming at this from a very practical, workflow-centered standpoint. I care less about lab charts, MTF curves, and edge-to-edge sharpness numbers. What matters to me is how fast I can work, how the footage looks, and how much the lens improves the overall feel of the houses I shoot. So let's rewind a little bit to where I was before getting this lens. Before the Viltrox 14mm, my setup was a bit compact. I was primarily shooting interiors with the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Yes, the ultrawide on the iPhone is around 13mm, which is actually a surprisingly capable ultrawide for real estate work. It's sharp, vibrant, and easy to carry around. Switching to my Sony a7C II for more cinematic control wasn't really an option. My widest lens there was 20mm, sometimes 24. 20mm is usable, but when you're shooting tight spaces, especially condos or smaller houses, it feels limiting. You want a sense of space, the airy feeling of a room, and with 20mm, you're just missing that little extra breath that makes interiors feel expansive without warping them beyond recognition. So I started looking for an ultrawide lens that would sit on my Sony and give me something closer to the iPhone's 13mm while still letting me shoot full frame. That's when I found the Viltrox 14mm f4. And let me tell you, this lens was a game changer for the workflow, especially for its price. But before that, you know what I've been trying to fix with my MacBook? It's great on its own, but the moment you try to actually work on it, it starts to feel a bit limited. So this is the setup I ended up using. MacBook, external monitor, mouse, and this from Tubinon. It's the UDS015M docking station, and it basically just ties everything together. Now, instead of plugging things one by one, it's just one cable, and everything connects. Monitor, mouse, storage, even Ethernet if I need it. And it's actually pretty loaded. You've got two HDMI ports, plus a USB-C video port that can do 4K output, so if you ever go full desk setup, it can handle multiple displays. There are also 7 USB ports in total, both USB-C and USB-A, with speeds up to 10 gigabits per second, so moving files doesn't feel slow. You get 2.5 gigabit Ethernet as well, which is great if you want something faster and more stable than Wi-Fi, plus SD and TF 4.0 card slots for quick transfers. Power-wise, it uses a 150 watt DC input with 30 watt power delivery to your laptop while everything's connected. And yeah, this works with Apple Silicon MacBooks from M1 up to M5, both Air and Pro. But for me, this kind of setup just makes more sense. It's not ultra portable, but it's also not locked to a desk. And the funny part is, once you get used to having this extra screen and everything connected, going back to just the MacBook feels like you're working on a backup device. If you're interested, I left the links below. There were a few things that drew me to this lens. First, the price point. For what it offered, a wide-angle view, autofocus, and full-frame coverage, the Viltrox 14mm felt like a no-brainer. But more importantly, it addressed the biggest limitation I had with my Sony: field of view. Second, size and weight. This is a lightweight lens, which is huge for someone who spends most of the day moving through houses, setting up gimbals, and constantly repositioning. A heavier lens can completely slow down your workflow, and I know a lot of videographers out there undervalue this because even half a pound difference can feel like a ton after a few hours of shooting. Finally, I like the simplicity. I wasn't looking for crazy aperture capabilities or lenses that require filters to tame flare. I wanted a lens I could mount, focus, and shoot. End of story. Mounting it on a gimbal for the first time was surprisingly easy. Because of the lightweight design, balancing the setup was painless, which meant I could start shooting almost immediately without fiddling for 10 minutes to get the gimbal to sit right. That might sound minor, but in a real estate shoot, every second counts. You're often racing daylight, clients have tight schedules, and the last thing you want is to waste time on gear issues. Now, once I started filming, the first thing I noticed was just how much more room the lens gave me. Shooting in narrow hallways or tight kitchens felt liberating. I could now capture the entire space in a single frame without having to rely on multiple pans or tricky stitching. And for real estate videos, that sense of space is everything. It makes room look bigger, airy, and inviting without feeling like you're distorting reality. Now I know some people will say, but f4 is slow. You need f2.8 or f1.8 for cinematic shallow depth of field and low light work. Here's the thing, for real estate interiors, the f4 aperture is honestly not a big deal. Most interiors are well lit, and for those that are not, I can always bump the ISO. Yes, bumping the ISO introduces noise, but in my experience, noise in interior walkthroughs doesn't distract viewers. Most people are not scrutinizing the technical perfection. They're focusing on the layout, the flow, and the vibe of the house. And really, for that type of content, a little noise at ISO 3200 or even 6400 isn't noticeable when the footage is properly color graded. So the f4, totally acceptable for my workflow, and I would argue the trade-off for having such a lightweight, ultra-wide lens is well worth it. Being a 14mm ultra-wide, you're always going to get some distortion, especially at the edges. This is normal. With the Viltrox 14mm, I noticed slight barrel distortion along the edges, but here's the key. It's subtle, and for the type of viewers who watch real estate videos, it's barely noticeable unless you're actively looking for it. I have a lot of footage where the edge distortion isn't corrected in post, and nobody has ever mentioned it. The goal of the video is to make the house feel open and natural, and the lens does that perfectly. I honestly don't feel the need to fight the distortion because the benefits of that extra ultra-wide view outweigh the downsides. One of the things I didn't expect to be so impactful was how much easier the lens made gimbal work. Because the lens is lightweight, I could pivot, tilt, and track subjects much faster. I shot an entire condo walkthrough and barely had to rebalance the gimbal once throughout the shoot. In real estate videography, momentum is everything. You want to flow through rooms quickly and capture the essence of the space before the light changes or the client gets impatient. So the lightweight design, not just convenient, it's a productivity booster. Before I had the Viltrox 14mm, I would often rely on my iPhone 13 Pro Max ultra-wide. That lens is 13mm, so the field of view is slightly wider, but there are limitations. Motion blur, color grading flexibility, and obviously the cinematic control we get from a full-frame Sony sensor. Switching to the Viltrox 14mm, I immediately noticed the difference in color rendition, depth, and overall feel. Sure, it's just a millimeter difference in focal length, but moving to a larger sensor with the ultra-wide gave me the extra cinematic look I was after. Smooth gimbal shots, control over ISO, and the ability to color grade without losing quality, all the things you can't do with a phone camera no matter how good it is. So yes, it filled the gap perfectly. I can finally get ultra-wide cinematic footage on my Sony, where previously I was stuck with either 20mm on Sony or ultra-wide on iPhone. The Viltrox 14mm isn't just for interiors. I also started using it for exterior walkthroughs, which is another area where ultra-wide shines. When you're capturing the front of a house, the yard, and landscaping, 14mm allows you to include more context in a single shot. You don't have to rely on multiple pans or wide tracking shots to tell the story of the property. Even with distortion on the edges, I don't find it distracting. Trees and buildings slightly bending at the edges doesn't change the narrative, it just gives the viewer a wider sense of scale, which is exactly what you want for real estate videos. Another pleasant surprise was autofocus. The Viltrox 14mm's autofocus is surprisingly reliable. I was able to move quickly through rooms, track people, and switch focus points without missing shots. Of course, it's not as fast as Sony's native GM lenses or some high-end options, but for real estate it's more than adequate. I rarely have to use manual focus, which saves time, especially when the goal is smooth walkthroughs rather than shallow depth of field perfection. In terms of handling, it's compact, lightweight, and feels sturdy for its price. It doesn't feel flimsy, which is comforting when you're constantly mounting and unmounting it from a gimbal. While it's mostly plastic, the build inspires confidence. I've never worried about dropping it or it coming loose on a gimbal. For the type of work I do, fast-paced, moving through multiple rooms and properties in a day, this lens is built for that environment. If I sum up my experience in one sentence, the Viltrox 14mm f4 is an ultra-wide lens that actually makes real estate videography more enjoyable and productive. It gives me the field of view I need to capture tight spaces. The f4 aperture is perfectly workable with modern ISO capabilities, and the lens is lightweight, so gimbal use is smooth and quick. Sure, slight distortion is present, but not a deal breaker for my viewers. Autofocus is reliable enough for practical shooting scenarios. For me, it bridged the gap between the iPhone's ultra-wide convenience and the cinematic control of my full-frame Sony. And once I started shooting with it, I realized just how much I had been limiting my compositions with the iPhone 13 Pro Max. If you're a real estate videographer or any content creator shooting interiors and exteriors on a tight schedule, The Viltrox 14mm is worth serious consideration. It's not about specs on paper, it's about how it performs in the real world, in your workflow, and in the kind of shots your clients actually care about. For me personally, this lens was a game changer. It's not the fastest lens, it's not the most expensive, and it won't give you crazy bokeh, but it solves the core problem, capturing wide, immersive shots that make a property feel open, clean, and inviting, all without slowing me down. In short, if you've been struggling with field of view limitations on your full-frame camera, this lens might be exactly what you're looking for. It's practical, lightweight, and produces footage that looks and feels professional for real estate content. Give it a try, the links are below. But that's it for this one. Drop a sub or like if you feel like supporting the channel, and as always, until the next one, stay safe.